My name is Alex Rogers. I'm Science Director of the Nippon Foundation Nekton Ocean Census Program. And today I'm going to talk to you about adaptations to living around deep sea hydrothermal vents. So what is a hydrothermal vent? Well, these are places in the sea floor where cold seawater penetrates the crust, usually through fissures and cracks, and then comes into contact with very hot rock underneath the seafloor, usually around a magma chamber. When it comes into contact with this hot rock, a very complex chemical exchange takes place. So oxygen, for example, is stripped out of the seawater, so it becomes anoxic. The seawater in turn takes up other chemicals such as hydrogen sulfide, methane, various metallic sulfides as well. And as it's heated, that water becomes buoyant and rushes up towards the sea floor, where it exits sometimes as these very characteristic black smokers at temperatures between 3 and more than 400 degrees C. If that seawater is diluted with other cold seawater as it moves through the rock, then it will exit the seafloor at lower temperatures. These might be at temperatures around 200 degrees C, in which case the vents form what are called white smokers, or it can exit the seafloor as diffuse flow, where the water temperature is only somewhere between 10 and 20 degrees C, but still enriched in hydrogen sulfide and other chemicals. So what are the characteristics of hydrothermal vents when it comes to life? Well, for starters, the chemicals in that vent fluid represent abundant chemical energy, and this can be used as a substrate for what's called chemosynthesis, essentially the generation of energy and the fixation of carbon using chemical energy rather than energy from sunlight. As I said, the water is hot, so these environments are thermally very stressful. There's no oxygen in the vent end member fluid, the undiluted fluid. So hypoxia is another big problem for life around vents. And then there's this cocktail of chemicals in the vent fluid itself: hydrogen sulfide and various heavy metals, even radionuclides. And these are generally very toxic to life. So for example, in humans, hydrogen sulfide binds to cytochrome oxidase, an important metabolic enzyme, and is a poison. So how do animals actually adapt to live on vents? Well, let's take this abundance of chemical energy first of all. I've taken as an example the giant tube worm that's found on vents in the Pacific Ocean. This animal, Riftia pachyptilla, was one of the first found around hydrothermal vents in the Galapagos Rift in the late 1970s. This worm has this very obvious red plume at the top of the animal. This is an adaptation to give it a very large surface area to take up oxygen, but also hydrogen sulfide and other nutrients. The animal doesn't have a mouth. What it has instead is an organ called the trophosome, which is a special organ which carries sulfur bacteria. So it transports hydrogen sulfide in the blood to this organ, and the bacteria extract hydrogen sulfide and oxidize it to produce energy and to use that to fix carbon. And incidentally, the carbon sources around these vents include carbon dioxide, as on land, but also sometimes carbon monoxide as well. Other animals also have bacterial symbionts inside their bodies. These are called endosymbionts. Some of them have bacterial symbionts outside their bodies, and they carry them on their external surfaces, and these are ectosymbionts. A good example of an animal which carries ectosymbionts is the very famous vent shrimp, Rhimicaris exoculata, which carries bacteria on its gills and on other surfaces of the body from which it derives nutrition. The famous yeti crabs also grow bacteria on hairs, on their carapaces, and it's thought they derive nutrition by simply scraping the bacteria off with their chelae and feeding on them. So how about the stresses around hydrothermal vents? How do organisms cope with these massively high temperatures and all these toxic chemicals and a lack of oxygen? Well, the simple answer is that actually in many cases they don't. What they do is they live on the interface between the hot and chemically rich vent fluids and normoxic seawater. So there's a very delicate balance here in where the organism maintains itself in the environment. So what sort of adaptations do these organisms have? Well, when dealing with low oxygen, there are many adaptations which vent organisms exhibit. The first and very obvious one is they enhance their gill surface area. And in the graphs on this slide, what you can see are comparisons of gill surface area in vent organisms versus non-vent organisms, in this case crustaceans. And you will see that the vent organisms have not only a larger gill surface area, but also the distance that oxygen has to travel from the outside to the blood system inside the gills is actually smaller in vent organisms than non-vent organisms. Another adaptation that crustaceans have in particular is enhanced scaphognathites area. Now you're probably wondering right now what a scaphognatite is. It's actually an oar-like structure that's used to irrigate the gills. So it pumps water past the gills. And in hydrothermal vent animals or vent crustacea, the scaphognatite has a larger surface area than in non-vent organisms to help with irrigating those gills with as much oxygen as possible. Another adaptation is to have oxygen binding proteins. In many animals, this is hemoglobin. Well, in the photographs you can see here a vent clam we actually collected off the South Sandwich Islands. You'll see that the tissues of the animal are really red and the tissues are sitting in red blood. That's hemoglobin, and it's used to bind oxygen, take up oxygen from the environment and store it so the organism can use it when it needs to. In crustaceans, they use hemocyanin, which is actually a blue pigment, so their blood is blue rather than red. If we look at the oxygen binding proteins of hydrothermal vent organisms versus organisms from normal environments, what we find is that the affinity for oxygen in vent organisms is much higher. What this means is that the animals can take up oxygen from very low oxygen tensions, and they can store oxygen until they need it under conditions of oxygen stress. Coming back to our giant tube worm, Riftia pachyptilla, the hemoglobin actually has two functions. First of all, it transports oxygen as in most other organisms, but it also binds hydrogen sulfide. So it can safely transport hydrogen sulfide, which, as I said earlier, is toxic to most other life, from the gills, that big feathery red plume, down to the trophosome, the organ which actually houses the sulfur bacteria. So how do these organisms deal with some of the toxins in their environment? As with coping with stress in normal deep sea ecosystems, and in particular coping with stress from very high pressure, organisms around vent environments also use organic osmolytes to detoxify some of the toxic materials around hydrothermal vents. These are a whole range of different organic osmolytes, and they occur in different concentrations in different vent organisms, but they are part of the detoxification mechanism for these vent animals. Another way that animals adapt to life around vents is through their behaviour. And here you see an example of Alvinella, the Pompeii worm. These worms live in chitinous tubes. And although the temperatures outside the tubes can often be much higher than the animal can tolerate, the temperature inside the tubes is regulated in a microenvironment. So when things get too hot, the worms simply pop into their tubes where conditions are much more amenable to life. We've got to remember that hydrothermal vents are very dynamic environments. So the animals have to cope with very fast shifts in the amount of vent fluid that's coming out the vent. And indeed, when we've been exploring hydrothermal vents, for example, in Antarctica, we've actually found animals which have burns on them because of the billowing vent fluid has actually caught them out and actually burnt the muscle in the animal, in one of its limbs or elsewhere. So the animals don't necessarily get this 100% right all the time, and some of them probably do end up getting cooked, but on the whole they use behavioural mechanisms to adjust their environment to one in which they can survive. Another adaptation is at the molecular level. So if you live in a very hot environment, it's useful to have thermostable enzymes, structural proteins. Essentially, all the molecules of life have amino acid substitutions which make them more stable to high temperatures. And animals like Alvinella pompeiana, the Pompeii worm, have some of the most thermostable enzymes known in the animal kingdom. Another very interesting adaptation is the expression of molecular chaperones. The first of these molecular chaperones that became generally known to science is something called heat shock protein 70. It's the 70 kilodalton, that's the molecular weight, heat shock protein, and it was found to be expressed in organisms, first of all, as an adaptation to increased temperature. It's now been discovered that these heat shock proteins are part of a general stress response. So they're not only expressed in response to high temperatures, they are also expressed in response to other types of stress as well. So maybe low oxygen, cold shock. So there's a whole variety of stressful conditions that can actually cause the expression of heat shock proteins. So if we look at the expression of heat shock proteins in the vent shrimp, Rimicaris exoculata, what we find is that two types of HSP70, heat shock protein 70, are massively induced when the animals are subject to an increase in temperature. However, there are also heat shock proteins in the vent shrimp which are just expressed at a high level all the time. What molecular chaperones do is they actually protect other molecules. So they prevent other molecules becoming misfolded or damaged as a result of exposure to heat. And that's why these animals are expressing heat shock proteins all the time, because they live in a thermally stressful environment. But when they encounter particularly warm water, then these other types of heat shock protein are also expressed to give them extra protection. So what you can see in this slide are some photographs of hydrothermal vent chimneys which we sampled in the Antarctic. And you can see the inside of one of these chimneys is coated in copper pyrite, and the other one actually has copper sulfide. Both of these materials are obviously heavy metals, and they're normally toxic to most life. So how do the animals cope with this? Well, we've already talked about organic osmolytes, but there are other mechanisms as well. So in this vent crab, for example, Segonzackia mesatlantica, which is a common predator on hydrothermal vents in the Atlantic, they express a group of molecules called metallothioneins. And these metallothioneins bind heavy metals to render them less toxic or non-toxic, and the animal can either store them or get rid of them, excrete them. So again, there is an adaptation at the molecular level to cope with the stressful environment of the vent. So to summarize all that, deep sea hydrothermal vents are very stressful environments in which to live. However, the benefit of living around these vents is access to almost endless chemical energy. So there's a big drive for organisms to actually adapt to live around these systems. And also there's the fact that most other animals just can't enter these environments because they're too toxic. So there's probably something going on here in terms of lack of predation as well. So these vent environments are very hot. We have problems with hypoxia and the presence of toxic chemicals such as heavy metals. And I've spoken to you today about some of the adaptations to this. Obviously, animals have behaviors which help them avoid the worst of the conditions. They have special adaptations to take up oxygen from a hypoxic environment, and they have molecular mechanisms to cope with both thermal stress and also the presence of toxic chemicals.